So Simple tutorial. Good morning students, welcome to SST So Simple tutorial. Today we are here to do one short revision of the lesson The Making of Global World. Students, globalization is not a new phenomenon. It existed in some forms or the other since early times. Since then, it has gradually evolved. From ancient times, travelers, traders, pilgrims, etc. have traveled long distances for various reasons. And when they moved, they carried with them goods, money, ideas, inventions, and even germs and diseases. This is what our history says. So let us start our revision with Unit 1 Pre-Modern World with Silk Route. Actually, silk routes are a very good example of pre-modern trade and cultural links between distant parts of the world. Let us discuss Silk Route first. Dear students, Chinese silk was in great demand during the ancient period because of its fine quality. It became a fashion, especially among the royalty and the upper classes in many countries, to wear clothes made of this expensive material. So the route along which Chinese silk was transported to the Mediterranean region became famous as Silk Route. But silk was not the only commodity that traveled through it. Besides silk, Chinese pottery, textiles and spices from India also traveled this route. In the return journey through this route, what used to come from Europe was nothing but gold and silver. So this is about trade. But besides trade, was there any other contribution of this route? Yes, this route also contributed to the spread of religion. Buddhism spread to the West and Central Asia, China including Tibet, Korea and Japan through the Silk Route. Christian missionaries and later on Muslim preachers also traveled along this route. So how old is this route? Students, this route had open trade with the West since the 2nd century BC and remained in use until 1453 AD when the Ottoman Empire boycotted trade with China and closed them. Have you heard about Marco Polo? Yes, the same name written behind your school bus. He was a famous merchant from Venice. He had used the Silk Road to travel from Italy to China. And while he returned to Venice in 1295, he used the Silk Road route only. So students, why is this example quoted here? The answer is simple. The sense is to basically understand the significance of silk routes, to understand how it connected distant places in the pre-modern world. Let us now see the contribution of food to the process of globalization of the early periods. Students, when people or say traders used to move long distances, they carried with them their food and food habits. These were then transplanted in the new lands, and over time these became the established practices in those countries. Take the example of spaghetti and noodles. It is believed that noodles traveled west from China where they are known as spaghetti. Also, Arab travelers took pasta to Sicily. Sicily is an island in Italy today. Okay. Take the example of most common foods like potatoes, soya, groundnuts, tomatoes, chilies, etc. These foods were not known to our ancestors some 500 years ago. Why? Because these foods have their origin in America. So they came to Europe and Asia only after Columbus discovered America. Thus, many of our common food have their origin in America. Potato, dear students, wherever it spread or say went, Europe or Asia, it proved to be boon for the poor. Since it was cheap, it became the basic food of the poor. Europe's poor began to live longer because of potato. Unfortunately,
In mid-1840s, a disease destroyed potato crop in Ireland. The poor peasants had no alternative food to substitute potato. Therefore, hundreds of thousands died of starvation because of scarcity of potato. Till 15th century students, silk routes were the principal route of travel between Asia and Europe or Africa. Two major events happened in this period. First, the European sailors found a sea route to Asia. Second, the European sailors also discovered America. You all must be aware of the names of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, isn't it? Because of these two developments, movements of goods and people between different continents became shorter and faster. The word America students used in the present context includes North America, South America as well as the Caribbean. Okay. The discovery of America led to the enhancement of wealth of Europe. European countries like Spain and Portugal were very greedy of gold and silver. They expected huge quantity of gold in South America. Actually, Europeans believed that somewhere in this new land there was a place of immense wealth, the city of gold known as El Dorado. That is why many expeditions set off in search of El Dorado. And by the mid 16th century, there was a mad rush in Europe to develop colonies in America. They established their rule over there with the help of their military power. But they did not spare any other method either to establish their colonies there. For example, Spanish conquerors launched a biological warfare in America. They carried the germ of smallpox in their bodies and spread the germs in those regions that they wanted to conquer. The conquerors were immune to this disease, but because of their long isolations, the American inhabitants had no immunity against this disease. So once introduced, the germs spread the deadly disease and killed the whole community. As a result, they conquered those regions easily. So we can say that the global transfer of disease in the pre-modern world also helped in the colonization of America. Students, the image of Europe that we have today is quite different what was until 19th century. Poverty and hunger were common. Cities were overcrowded. Deadly diseases were widespread. Religious conflicts were also common and dissenters were persecuted. Therefore, thousands of people left Europe to settle in America. By the 18th century, in America, plantations were growing cotton, sugar, etc. for European markets. Just recall the triangular slave trade that we read in the French Revolution chapter. Okay. On the contrary, until the 18th century, China and India were among the richest countries of the world. They dominated the world trade. But from the 15th century onwards, China started to restrict its overseas contacts and went into isolation. So, the reduced role of China on one hand and the increasing importance of America on the other gradually moved the center of the world trade towards the west. Thus, Europe emerged as the center of world trade. Let us now go to Unit 2, the 19th century. This 19th century is very important. Three types of movements or flows took place within international economic exchange. First, flow of trade. Second, flow of labor. And third, the movement of capital. Flow of trade refers to the trade in goods. Goods were exported from one country and imported by another, just as India exported tea and spices and imported manufactured goods. Flow of labor refers to the migration of labor from one country to another, mainly in search of employment. Flow of capital means movement of capital from one country to another for short-term or long-term investments. All of these flows represented that a world economy was gradually emerging. In a world economy, different economies get integrated and come to depend upon each other for various needs. This process only got acceleration at the end of the 20th century and early 21st century and came to be known as globalization. Okay. In the late 18th century, industrialization and population growth had increased the demand for food grains in Britain. This situation resulted in the increase in food grain prices. But there was something called corn laws, which was in operation in Britain. What is this law? This law restricted the import of corn, so this law kept corn prices at high level. Basically, this law was intended to promote and protect big landlords and farmers from cheap foreign imports of grain. This blockade of grains led to increased profits for their homeland farmers, and the farmers wished to retain this higher rate of profit. Now, due to this law, the British people had no choice but to buy grains only from within the country. The working class was thus unable to afford anything other than their food. This forced them to stop buying manufactured goods, which affected the profits of the industrialists. So, whereas the farmers and landowners benefited, the working class in the cities and the industries became unhappy. So, there was a lot of opposition to this law from the industrialists and urban dwellers. Then came the Irish potato famine of 1845. So, this law was finally repealed in 1946. After the law was repealed, British began to import food grains from the rest of the world. These products were relatively cheaper than British produced goods and food grains. Thus, the supply of corn from outside helped to bring down the prices and consumption in Britain increased. What happened thereafter in Britain? British agriculture could not compete with the prices of imported goods. Agriculture no more remained a profitable business. So the rural folks left their lands uncultivated and rushed to the cities to find jobs in industries. Some of them even migrated overseas. Now, from the mid 19th century, when industrial growth picked up speed, this resulted in higher incomes and therefore more food imports. Now, what is happening outside Britain? In Eastern Europe, Russia, America, and Australia, lands were being cleared to expand food production, basically to meet the demands of people. But production alone could not fulfill the objectives. Other infrastructural facilities were also needed. How was food to be transported? That means to connect the agricultural regions and seaports, new railway lines were required to be laid. Thus began the process of establishing railways and making ports. Besides, people had to settle on the lands to bring them under cultivation, which meant building of homes and settlements. All of these activities required labor and capital. So the demand for labor in America and Australia was met by migration of people. About 50 million people emigrated from Europe to America and Australia in the 19th century. And all over the world, some 150 million are estimated to have left their homes who crossed oceans in search of better future. As far as capital is concerned, it flowed from financial centers like London. So, by the 1890s, a global kind of agricultural economy had begun to take shape. An economy which was accompanied with the movement of labor. An economy which was accompanied with the flow of capital. The food no longer came from a nearby village, but from 1,000 miles away. This food was not grown by a peasant in his own land. It was grown by an agricultural worker in a large farm, which very recently had been a forest. Just see the change. The food was transported by railways and ships, built for that very purpose. So, dear students, what actually the abolition of corn laws in Britain did? It set in motion a new process. by which different nations of the world started to get integrated with the rest of the world. When the rest of the world was experiencing such changes, a similar type of change occurred in India, though on a small scale. In West Punjab, which is in Pakistan today, the British government laid a network of irrigational canals to transform the semi-arid regions into fertile lands that could grow wheat and cotton for export. These areas irrigated by these canals were called canal colonies. Those who settled there were peasants from other parts of Punjab.
I hope you have understood how world economy was taking shape. Let us now see the role of technology. In this topic, we will see the role of technology on food availability. Among the different areas of technology, we will pick up two. First, transport technology and the refrigeration technology. As far as transport is concerned, faster railways, lighter wagons, and large ships, they helped move food more quickly and cheaply from faraway farms to final markets. There is nothing much to discuss on this. Let us see what refrigeration technology did. Till the 1870s, demand for meat was met by importing animals from the rest of the world. Animals were shipped live from America to Europe and then they were slaughtered when they arrived their destination. But there were several problems in the transportation. Live animals occupied lot of space in the ship. In the journey, many fell ill and lost weight. Many others died or became unfit to eat. That is why eating meat was considered an expensive luxury and thus beyond the reach of the poor in Europe. Since the prices were high, hence demand was also less. But things changed with the development of refrigeration technology. Refrigerated ships enabled the transport of perishable foods over long distances. Now it was not required to import live animals. Animals were now slaughtered at the starting point and then transported as frozen meat. This reduced the shipping costs and thus lowered meat prices in Europe. So the poor people who depended on bread and potatoes could now afford to have meat in their diet. So students, this is how technology impacted on food availability. Let us now move on to the next small topic, late 19th century colonialism. From the late 1870s till the early 1900s, Western Europe followed a policy of imperialism called New Imperialism. But what was the force behind all this new imperialism? The force behind all this was Industrial Revolution. This Industrial Revolution increased the production capacity of Western states tremendously. There was thus an enormous hunger for raw materials to satisfy demands. So the Western powers sought colonies where raw materials were abundant and where they could be taken from at little cost or no cost. Their eyes were in fact on Africa, which was rich in iron, wood, oil, gold, diamonds, etc. Thanks to Industrial Revolution once again, that the European nations had superior weapons and warships that played an important role in their mission. This conquest of Africa took place between 1881 and 1914. Hence, the name of topic, late 19th century colonialism. European countries fought over African countries mainly for their natural resources. This conquest was basically the invasion, annexation, division and colonization of most of Africa by the European powers. Thus began bad days for the African natives. They were exploited badly. That is why, dear students, we say if Industrial Revolution brought prosperity for some, it also meant loss of freedom and livelihood for others. In 1885, at the request of German Chancellor Bismarck, the big European powers came together
at Berlin to complete the division of Africa between them. So by the end of 19th century, a significant part of Africa had been colonized by mainly seven European powers: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Belgium and Germany became new colonial powers. The US also became a colonial power later on by taking some colonies held earlier by Spain.
Let us now go to the next topic, rinderpest or the cattle plague.
First of all, we must know what rinderpest is. Students, it is a fast spreading viral disease which affects mainly the cattle. It is also known by the name cattle plague. But before we learn the role it played in Africa, let us now discuss what attracted the Europeans to Africa and then what problem these Europeans faced. Okay, so in the late 19th century, Europeans were attracted to Africa due to vast resources of land and minerals. They wanted to establish plantations to produce crops. They also wanted to establish mines to produce minerals. You know that crops and minerals were increasingly required in the fast industrializing Europe. Dear students, setting up of plantations and mines required a regular supply of large number of workers. But the Europeans overlooked some facts about the lifestyle of Africans. Africa had plenty of land and livestock that provided comfortable living to the natives. They hardly worked for wages. It is obvious if one has so much of both land and livestock, why would one work? What is the need to work? So, the Africans did not respond to the increasing demand for labor to work. This created shortage of labor. Thus, the hopes of Europeans were shattered, all because of the presence of plenty of livestock. So, unless they got labor, their very aim of colonizing Africa was going to fail. They were desperate for labor. They tried many methods to recruit and retain labor. For example, firstly, they imposed heavy taxes on them, which could be paid only if they worked for wages in plantations and mines. Second, they changed the inheritance laws in such a way that peasants were displaced from their lands. Only one member of a family was allowed to inherit land, as a result of which others were pushed into the labor market. Third, mine workers were confined in compounds and not allowed to move about freely. So all such methods were adopted by them. However, none of them worked. All these efforts failed to provide regular supply of adequate labor. Finally, relief came for the Europeans in the form of rinderpest. Rinderpest broke out in Africa in the late 1880s. It spread very fast, just like the jungle fire, and engulfed the whole continent. There was a huge loss of livestock. It is said to have killed almost 90% of cattle during the period of 5 years. Thus, it destroyed the African people's livelihood completely. Livestock being the principal source of livelihood for the Africans, they were driven to destitution and misery. Hence, they ended up working for the imperialists on plantations and mines against wages. So, this is a story of what happened in Africa. This shows how a disease can have an impact on people's livelihood and the local economy.
Let us now go to the next topic, indentured labor migration from India.
Let us see what your book says on indentured labor. A bonded labor under contract to work for an employer for a specific amount of time to pay off his passage to a new country or home. So it was basically a system of bonded labor which had started after the abolition of slavery. In this system, a contract was signed between the employer and the worker. The duration of work used to be clearly specified in the contract. In the 19th century, most of the laborers who went from India belonged to the present day regions of eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, central India, and the dry districts of Tamil Nadu. They were hired under contract and were promised a return travel to India after they had worked for 5 years in their plantations. Now the question is, why did they go? Students, in the mid 19th century, the cottage industries had declined. Land rents rose. Lands were cleared for mines and plantations. All these affected the lives of poor in these regions. They were unable to pay their rents. They became deeply indebted. There was widespread poverty. So, to escape from all these problems, they agreed to become indentured labor. The next question is, where did they go? So, the main destinations of the Indian laborers were the Caribbean islands, Mauritius and Fiji. Caribbean island means mainly Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname. The Tamil laborers mainly went to Ceylon and Malaya. Today's Sri Lanka was then called Ceylon. Now, how they were recruited? The laborers were recruited through the agents kept by the employer on commission. These agents used to contact the workers who used to explain them the work, wages, working conditions, etc. in the language understood by them. In order to lure workers, agents sometimes provided false information about final destinations, about modes of travel, about the nature of work and living as well as working conditions. Often, immigrants were not even told that they were to go on a long sea voyage. So, before signing the contract, immigrants got convinced that everything was rosy in the new place. Their misery was going to end and their life would change. But the truth was revealed only when they arrived at the plantations. They used to find things contrary to what they had imagined. They found living conditions bad and working conditions harsh. They had almost no legal rights. They were treated as virtual slave labor. If they tried to escape and unfortunately caught, they faced severe punishment. That is why, dear students, 19th century indenture has been described as a new system of slavery. Okay. Dear students, even when the lives are difficult, people find ways of survival. So did the laborers. Initially, the indentured laborers found it difficult to adjust to the harsh living conditions of the plantations, but very soon they discovered new ways of survival. They developed their own ways of entertainment. Since laborers from different cultural backgrounds worked and lived together, their culture intermingled and produced a new culture. Students, this fusion of culture is a part of making of the global world, where things from different places get mixed. They lose their original characteristics and become something entirely new. You all must have heard about Muharram. In Trinidad and even Tobago, this occasion is commemorated every year by the Muslims there as Hoseh. In fact, Muharram was taken to Trinidad by the indentured laborers from India when they went there to work in sugar plantations. The word Hoseh is actually derived from the word Hussein. They take out processions there, but the beauty of Hoseh is that it is joined by workers of all races and religions. The music of the Caribbean also reflects the multicultural influences that shaped the Caribbean. Chutney music is one such Indo-Caribbean music form which is popular in Trinidad and Guyana. Similarly, the protest religion of Rastafarianism is also said to reflect social and cultural links with Indian migrants to the Caribbean. Now let us see, where did these laborers go after their contract ended? Most of them came back, but some indentured workers opted to make Caribbean their home. Of those who came back to India, some returned to the Caribbean again after a short spell here. As a result, there are a large community of people of Indian origin in these countries. Have you heard the name of V.S. Nepal? He is one such person. He had won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2001. Similarly, there are a number of famous West Indies cricketers like Sunil Narayan, Ravi Rampal, Shiv Narayan Chandrapal, Ram Naresh Sarwan, etc. They are descendants of the migrated indentured labor from India.
Let us now go to the next topic, Indian trade, colonialism and the global system.
My dear students, India was a home to fine cotton. Indian cotton had a worldwide market, including Britain. These were paid for in gold and silver. With the coming of industrial revolution in Britain, things began to change fast. First of all, the industrialists pressurized its government to put a restriction on the import of cotton to protect the local industries. So, to promote the interests of the British textile industries, the British government imposed heavy import duty on the import of cloth in Britain. Thus, the export of Indian cotton declined drastically. Now, whereas the exports of manufacturers declined, exports of something else rose. What are they? First of all, the export of raw cotton, it rose from 5% to 35% between 1812 and 1871. Indigo, as such, remained an important item for export. Next, opium. From 1820s, opium also became India's largest export to China for some time. In fact, Britain grew opium in India and exported it to China, and with the money earned through this sale, it financed its tea and other imports from China.
Over the 19th century, dear students, British manufacturers flooded the Indian markets. Food grains and raw material exports from India to Britain and the rest of the world increased. But the value of British exports to India was much higher than the value of British imports from India. So Britain had a trade surplus with India.
Britain used this surplus to balance its trade deficits with other countries. Britain also used this surplus to pay the home charges. Home charges included private remittances from India to Britain by British officials and traders, interest payment on India's external debt, and pensions of British officials in India.
Let us now revise Unit 3, Interwar Economy. Students, there have been two world wars so far, the First World War and the Second World War. The First World War was fought from 1914 to 1918 between two power blocs, the Allies and the Central Powers. The Allies included Britain, France, Russia, and was later joined by America. The Central Powers included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. Dear students, when the First World War began, many governments thought that it would be over soon, but that did not happen. It lasted for 4 long years, and thus it pushed the world economy into such a crisis that it took over 3 decades to overcome. Okay, so what kind of war was it? Let us see. It was not a traditional kind of war that was fought on horses and elephants with spears and swords. It was the first modern industrial war. The countries fighting the war were all industrialized nations. For the first time, machine guns, tanks, aircrafts, and chemical weapons, etc., were used on a massive scale. And all of these were the products of modern large scale industries. Millions of soldiers, my dear students, were recruited from all over the world and moved to the front lines to fight the war. The toll in this war was 9 million dead and 20 million injured. Most of those killed and injured were men of working age. This had a very disastrous effect on the European society and economy. The number of able-bodied workforce got reduced in Europe. Since the number of healthy, able-bodied person reduced, the number of bread earners of the family declined. Hence, the incomes of the household also declined. One more change that was visible in the society was that during the war, the requirements of armaments and other war related goods increased. So the industries were restructured to produce war related goods. But then, who would work in those factories? Men were already sent to fight the war. So it was for the first time that women stepped out of their homes to do job in the factories. You will be surprised to know that by 1917, more than 7 lakh women in Britain were employed in ammunition factories. The war weakened British economy badly. Britain, which was the world's leading economy before the war, had to borrow large sums of money from US banks and their public. Thus, after the war, US emerged as an international creditor. Let us now go to the next topic, post-war recovery. Post-war recovery means economic recovery in the period following the end of war. The war had a devastating impact on Europe. It had inflicted huge economic costs on the fighting European powers. So, post-war economic recovery was not going to be easy. Let us see what happened in Britain. As I mentioned before, that Britain was the world's leading economy before the war. But what happened after the war? Its economy shattered. During war, British mills were busy with war production to meet the needs of army. This immediately resulted in the decline of Manchester imports to India. This is one. 2. When the war prolonged, Indian factories were asked to supply war needs. War needs like jute bags, cloth for army uniform, tents, leather boots, etc. So new factories were set up in India. New workers were employed and were asked to work for longer hours to meet the demands. Naturally, this was good for Indian industries then. Indian industries strengthened. Such developments took place in Japan also. But when the war got over and Britain tried to recapture its old position, it could not. And that is one of the reasons why its economy crumbled. Third, as we have already discussed earlier, Britain had borrowed large sums of money from the US to finance its war expenditures. So in the post-war period, Britain was burdened with huge external debt too. I hope you have understood these points. Dear students, the war had led to economic boom. So when the war ended, things changed. The government also reduced its war expenditures, so production contracted, and this led to increased unemployment. Understood? Let us now see the impact of World War on agricultural economies. For this, we will see the case of wheat producers. Before the war, Eastern Europe like Russia was the major supplier of wheat. But during the war, this supply was disrupted. Russian supplies of wheat was cut off. So this was the time when there was a dramatic expansion of wheat production in the USA, Canada and Australia to feed Europe. But when the war was over and the production in Eastern Europe revived, there was a glut in wheat output. This resulted in fall in grain prices, decline in rural income, and the farmers were caught in debt. I hope you understood this point. Let us now go to the next topic, rise of mass production and consumption. Dear students, after a short period of economic troubles after the war, the US recovered faster. What actually helped the US in its faster economic growth was mass production based on assembly line practice. Economic boom in the US in the 1920s was the result of mass-produced consumer goods like cars, fridge, washing machines, radio, etc. These products were available in the most affordable price to the consumers. In addition, easy and cheap loans were also available to the consumers. So before we proceed further, we must know the person who was pioneer of mass production. He was Henry Ford. He had a car manufacturing plant at Detroit in the US. He adopted the assembly line practice in producing cars. Now let us see what this assembly line is, how the system works here. A car under production moves on a conveyor belt. Workers line up along the conveyor belt. As the car body appears before them, each of them fits in the component that he is expected to do, and then let the car pass to the next worker, who then does his part of job. So one worker doesn't do the entire work. A worker on an assembly line does his part only, repeatedly, mechanically. A worker does not move, rather the work moves. A worker has to just stand in front of the conveyor belt. This results in faster production. Output per worker increases. As a result of adopting this method, Ford was able to produce cars at an interval of 3 minutes. The first mass-produced car was T model Ford car. Initially, workers could not cope with the pace of the assembly line operations. They started to quit in large numbers. So what Ford did, he acted smartly. He doubled the wage rate to attract more workers. He also banned trade unions in his plant. And to recover the high wage, he speeded up the production line. The net result was that in spite of paying higher wages, his cost of production remained the same. Ford's practice of production soon spread in the US as well as in Europe. Mass production lowered the cost of engineered goods. Car production in the US rose from 2 million in 1919 to more than 5 million in 1929. Similar was the case with other consumer goods. There was an increased demand for fridge, washing machine, cars, etc. Then this was followed with the boom in house construction, all of which were available on easy loans. This brought prosperity in the US. Thus, mass production helped a lot in the economic recovery of the US. In 1923, US was exporting capital to the rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. But all this did not last long. By 1929, the world plunged into a depression. Let us now revise the Great Depression. Dear students, Great Depression began shortly after the October 24, 1929 and lasted till mid-1930s. During this period, most parts of the world experienced disastrous decline in production, employment, incomes and trade, thus bringing hardships, joblessness, homelessness and hunger to millions. In general, it affected everyone, but the worst affected were the communities connected with agriculture. This was so because the fall in agricultural prices were greater and more prolonged than that in the prices of industrial goods. Let us now discuss the causes of Great Depression. We shall discuss the causes broadly under 3 heads. 1. Overproduction in agriculture. 2. Withdrawal of US loans. And 3. Raising of import duty by the US. Many people believe that the Great Depression began with the stock market crash of October 1929. The Great Depression might have come soon after the collapse of the stock market, but this doesn't mean it happened because of it. The depression was caused by a combination of several factors. First, the main cause of the Great Depression was overproduction in agriculture. Farms were producing more than what people could afford to buy. So the result was obvious. We all know the relationship of demand and supply and its impact on prices. When supply exceeds demand for a good or service, prices fall. When demand exceeds supply, prices tend to rise. So the prices of agricultural produce fell. When the prices fell, the agricultural income also declined. Now, in order to maintain their overall income or say to compensate for the deficit, farmers expanded their production. The result of all this was that they produced more than what was required. The supply of agricultural produce was more than the consumers needed. This only further worsened the situation. There was a glut in the market, which further pushed the prices down and the income fell further.
The farm produce began to rot in the absence of buyers. Is that point clear? Okay. Second point. As all of you know that after the war, US became an international creditor. It had acquired a position when it could lend money to European countries. We had read just two classes ago that Britain had borrowed large sums of money from US banks as well as from companies to pay off loans. Similarly, in the mid 1920s, many other countries also took loans from the US to finance its investment. Things were going on well until the signs of trouble appeared. The stock market crashed. So, the overseas lenders of the US got panicked. The American capitalists stopped all loans and the reverse process started. They started to withdraw the loans. So the countries that depended crucially on US loans now faced an acute crisis. Just think, in the first half of 1928, US overseas loans amounted to more than $1 billion. 1 year later, it came down to one quarter of that amount. So students, this withdrawal of US loans affected much of the rest of the world. In Europe, it led to the failure of some major banks. It also led to the collapse of currencies such as the British pound sterling. In South America, it intensified the slump in agricultural and raw material prices. Next, after the stock market crash in 1929, the US Congress passed a law by which they doubled their import duties. Basically, this law was meant to protect American farmers from overseas competition. But the result proved otherwise. It backfired on them tremendously. Other countries retaliated and adopted a similar policy. They also increased their tariff. So the trade between nations came down suddenly for several years. US imports from and exports to Europe fell by two-thirds between 1929 and 1932, while overall globe trade also declined by almost the same level. So this step of the US hurt not just the US but the world economy and thus made the depression worse. I hope you have understood this point. Let us now see the impact of depression on US herself. Dear students, US was also severely affected by the depression. With the fall in prices and the anticipation of the depression, US banks had stopped domestic lendings and called back loans. That means the banks started demanding full payment of the loan immediately. Farmers could not sell their harvests, households were ruined, and businesses had collapsed. Just recall what was happening in the US economy during the 1920s. Americans were actually enjoying a life of prosperity, which was possible due to mass production with lower prices and higher wages. Workers were able to buy consumer goods. They were making purchases of refrigerators, washing machines, radios, and even T model Ford cars. It was not necessary to have money in hand they could buy on credit. But the circumstances were different now. Incomes had fallen. They could not repay what they had borrowed. As a result, they had to give up fridge, car, radio, or whatever they had bought on credit. As unemployment increased, people had to travel long distances in search of work. Banks were unable to recover investments, collect loans, and repay depositors. Banks went bankrupt and were forced to close. By 1933, dear students, over 4,000 banks had closed. Between 1929 and 1933, industrial production fell by about 47%. GDP declined by 30% and unemployment reached more than 20%. This is how students' depression affected the US. Let us now revise the next topic, India and the Great Depression. The tremors of depression were felt in almost every part of the world. Dear students, India was also affected by this depression. We have already learned this part in the lesson Nationalism in India, though in brief.
This shows that how the global economy was integrated by the 20th century. Let us discuss them point-wise. First, impact on trade. In the 19th century, colonial India was an exporter of agricultural goods and importer of manufactures. The depression had badly affected Indian trade. India's exports and imports nearly halved between 1928 and 1934. And as international prices crashed, prices in India also plunged down. Between 1928 and 1934, wheat prices in India fell by 50%. So this was the impact on trade. Now let us see impact on farmers. We have already discussed some time before that the worst sufferers during the depression were the agricultural communities. Peasants and farmers suffered more than urban dwellers. Peasants producing for the world market were the worst hit. Though agriculture prices fell sharply, the British government refused to reduce revenue demands. No concessions were shown to the farmers. In Bengal, we can see the case of jute producers. They grew raw jute. This raw jute was processed in factories to make gunny bags. Gunny bag was then exported. But due to depression, the export of gunny bag also collapsed. As gunny bag exports collapsed, the prices of raw jute crashed by more than 60%. So the jute growers fell into debt trap. And almost this is what happened all over the country. Peasants used up their savings. They mortgaged their lands. They sold their jewelry to meet their expenses. Let us see its impact on urban India now. The Great Depression, in a way, helped the urban people, especially the fixed income earners, like the landlords who got rents or the salaried middle class who got salaries. Since prices of different goods that they consumed came down, everything was costing them less. They experienced a rise in their real income. The government extended tariff protection to the industries. That means import duties were imposed on goods from other countries. This encouraged some investment in industries. Lastly, national movement. Since rural India was seething with unrest, depression gave an impetus to the national movement under Gandhiji. Mahatma Gandhi launched civil disobedience movement at the height of depression in 1931. Let us now go to the last unit, rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. Post-war here means post-Second World War. Student, the Second World War was fought between the Axis powers and the Allies. The Axis powers included mainly Nazi Germany, Japan and Italy, and the Allies included Britain, France, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. So the Allies were the same, isn't it? Now, what was the period? It was fought between 1939 and 1945. So, whereas the First World War lasted for 4 years, this war, the Second World War, lasted for 6 years. This war was fought on many fronts as well as in many places, over land, sea as well as the air. This time around also, death and destructions were enormous, much more than the First World War. 60 million people were killed, which amounted to about 3% of the world's population of 1939. This number includes all those killed directly or indirectly by the war. Besides soldiers, it included a large number of civilians. Millions more were injured and millions were made homeless. So we find that unlike the earlier wars, most of the death took place outside the battlefields. Besides loss of life, dear students, bombing had flattened cities and towns. It destroyed bridges, railways, factories, everything. It caused an immense amount of economic devastation. It crippled the economies worldwide. So reconstruction was the need of the time. Let us see what were the factors that shaped post-war reconstruction.
Students, two crucial influences shaped post-war reconstruction. The first was the US emergence as the dominant economic, political and military power in the Western field. The second was the dominance of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had made huge sacrifices to defeat Nazi Germany. It had also transformed itself from a backward agricultural country into a world power.
Let us now see post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods institutions.
So let us begin with what lessons that the economists and politicians drew from the interwar economic experiences. The first lesson that they drew was that an industrial society based on mass production cannot be sustained without mass consumption. So mass consumption is a necessary requisite to maintain production. But to ensure mass consumption, there was a need of high and stable income. That's natural, isn't it? Without income, how would one buy goods? Unless income is regular and stable, consumption will not happen. Then incomes could not be stable if employment was unstable. So stable incomes required steady and full employment. But markets alone could not guarantee full employment. Neither the market can give job to everyone nor it can always give jobs. Therefore, governments are required to step in to minimize fluctuations of price, output and employment. The governments, can fix prices so that goods cannot be sold above or below that fixed price. This is how stability can be brought in prices. So, economic stability could be ensured only through the intervention of the governments. This was lesson number 1. The second lesson was related to a country's economic links with the outside world. The goal of full employment could only be achieved if government had the power to control flows of goods, capital and labor. As the Second World War was over, the job of rebuilding national economies began. Thus, the main aim of the post-war international economic system was to preserve economic stability and full-time employment in the industrial world. So, to prepare its framework, that is, to prepare rules, regulations and procedures to ensure economic stability for the major economies of the world, delegates from 44 nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA on the 1st of July 1944. Their purpose was to agree on a system of economic order and international cooperation that would help countries recover from the devastations of the war and promote long-term global growth. This meeting came to be known as the Bretton Woods Conference. What came out from this meeting? The participating countries agreed to set up two financial institutions. One, the International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, and two, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that is IBRD, which is popularly known as the World Bank. These two institutions, my dear students, are called Bretton Woods institutions. They are also called Bretton Woods twins. And the world economic system after the Second World War is also described as Bretton Woods system. So IMF and IBRD were made to rebuild Europe after the Second World War. The conference also set up a modified gold standard to help countries maintain value of their currencies. Thus, IMF was charged with overseeing the international monetary system to ensure exchange rate stability and encouraging members to eliminate exchange restrictions that hinder trade. The World Bank was set up to help rebuild Europe and Japan after the Second World War. How was this to be achieved? The World Bank was to finance the reconstruction of European nations devastated by war. Decision making in these institutions, my dear students, is controlled by the Western industrial nations,
but the US has the right to veto the decisions of IMF and the World Bank. In this conference, it was agreed to make paper currency as the legal tender of the member countries. And what would be that currency? The US dollar. Now, what would be the value of this US dollar? They fixed the value of US dollar in terms of gold. It was decided that $35 would be equal to 1 ounce of gold. Now only US could hold gold as reserve. Other countries need not hold gold. They could instead hold US dollar as reserve. What about other countries? Other countries now were required to link their currencies to the US dollar. That means other countries will determine the value of their currencies against the US dollar. In a nutshell, we can say that in this system, national currencies, for example, the Indian rupee was pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate, and the dollar itself was anchored to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce of gold. The conference thus, we can say, established dollar as an international currency. This new exchange rate system was called fixed exchange rate system. All exchange rates of different countries were now to be fixed under IMF. Let us now see the achievements of Bretton Woods institutions. The Bretton Woods system in its initial phase of existence was focused on rapid growth in industrialized countries. It began an era of such a growth of trade and income that was never seen before. World trade grew annually at over 8% between 1950 and 1970, and incomes also grew at the rate of nearly 5%. The unemployment rate averaged less than 5% in most industrial countries. These decades also saw the worldwide spread of technology also. As far as developing countries is concerned, they were in a hurry to become advanced industrial countries. Therefore, they started investing vast capital in importing industrial plant and equipment featuring modern technology. Let us go to the next topic, decolonization and independence. Dear students, the Second World War had weakened the imperialist countries of Europe. Their military as well economies had shattered during the war. Many scholars hold the view that the cost of maintaining their control over colonies had become too high for the colonial powers. When the World War ended, large parts of the world were still under European colonial rule. But by the next 2 decades, most colonies in Asia and Africa emerged as free, independent nations. Free means politically free, not free from poverty or miseries. Their standard of living was low, they were economically very backward. Decolonization raised hopes in them. They also wanted to catch up with the advanced industrialized nations to bring economic development. But then, what was the role of IMF and the World Bank here? Nothing. Recall students, the agenda of Bretton Woods Conference was to preserve the economic stability and employment of the industrialized nations, to meet the financial needs of industrialized countries that fought the Second World War, isn't it? In fact, that conference was not held to solve the problems of these newly independent countries, also called the Third World countries. Hence, IMF and the World Bank were accordingly designed to meet the financial needs of these industrial nations. They were not equipped to handle the challenges of poverty and lack of development in the former colonies. I hope you have understood what I wanted to say. But Japan, dear students, recovered soon. Not simply recovered, emerged as a great world economic power. And so did Europe. They also rebuilt their economies fast. So naturally what happened? They became less dependent on the IMF and the World Bank now. Thus, from the late 1950s onwards, the Bretton Woods institutions began to shift their attention towards developing countries. They began to help in the growth process of these countries. But these countries complained that they continued to be exploited economically by the European and American investors. Actually, what happened was that vital role came to be assigned to MNCs from America and Europe. The net result was paradoxical. How? See, the developing countries were trying to free themselves from the colonial influences of the past and counted as developed sovereign nations. And what we see here is that the IMF and World Bank imposed on these nations MNCs from the very same nations they were trying to free themselves. These MNCs actually kept exploiting the natural resources of the developing countries cheaply. They did nothing for the economic development of these developing countries. As a result, whereas the Western economies continued to grow, most developing countries did not experience any benefit in the 1950s and 60s. Understood? So, what happened next? These countries organized themselves as a group, the Group of 77, also called G77, to collectively pursue their common interests. In pursuit of this, they raised a demand for a new international economic order, NIEO. What did the developing countries mean by this new economic order? By the NIEO, they meant a system that would give them real control over their natural resources, that would provide them more development assistance, that would provide them fairer prices for raw materials, and that would provide them better access for their manufactured goods in developed countries' markets. Thus, the demand for setting up of NIEO was actually the expression of resentment and disappointment with the working of Bretton Woods twins. So students, we can say that G77 was a reaction to the activities of Bretton Woods twins. Let us now revise the last topic, end of Bretton Woods twins and the beginning of globalization. In the post-war period, Bretton Woods system was working nicely and there was a stable and rapid growth for some years. Then what happened that this system collapsed? Let us revisit Bretton Woods system once again. This system was based on fixed exchange rate system. How did this system work? In this system, the national currencies were pegged to the dollar and the dollar was pegged to gold. Countries could keep reserves in dollar. It was not necessary to keep reserves in gold. In turn, the US guaranteed redemption of dollar for gold on demand. So countries began accumulating US dollars as reserves. I think the matter is clear up to here. Let us now proceed. This new system worked well and stabilized world trade, especially between industrialized nations. Europe and Japan recovered from the war soon. European countries and Japan began to compete with the US in a range of industries. They accumulated large amounts of US dollars from sales of their export in the United States. So international demand for dollars soared, thus putting pressure on the US balance of payments. US started to move from trade surplus to trade deficit position. Meanwhile, the rising costs of overseas involvements like Vietnam War also weakened the US finances to some extent. There was growing concern over the stability of dollar. So the countries running trade surpluses with the US began to convert dollar reserves into gold. Thus, US gold reserves shrank rapidly. When the reserves of gold started shrinking, the US could not sustain this situation anymore and decided to abandon this system. Thus, in 1973, US had to delink dollar from gold. As a result, the system of fixed exchange rates collapsed and it was replaced by the system of floating exchange rates. That means now market will determine the value of currency of a country. I hope you have understood why the Bretton Woods system collapsed. This was first part. Let us go to the second part, the beginning of globalization. We will discuss them under different heads. 1. Changes in international financial system. 2. Unemployment in industrialized nations and shifting of MNCs production units to other countries. 3. Changes in Russia and China. So let us begin. Changes in international financial system. From the mid 1970s, the international financial system also changed many ways. Earlier, developing countries took loans and development assistance from international institutions. But their debt arose, especially Africa and Latin America, where they started borrowing heavily from private banks to finance their needs. This led them to lower incomes and increased poverty. Next, unemployment in industrialized nations and shifting of MNC production units to other countries. The economy of 1970s students experienced periods of inflation and high unemployment, and it continued till early 1990s. MNCs also began to shift production operations to low-wage Asian countries. You all are aware that low wages were an important factor in China's rapid economic growth and development, especially during the first decades after reform in the 1980s and 1990s. Naturally, MNCs got attracted to China and began investing there to capture world market. This relocating industries in low-wage countries stimulated world trade and flow of capital. Let us now see the third one, changes in Russia and China. After the revolution of 1949, communist government was established in China. Thereafter, China was cut off from the world economy for some time. China kept its economy closed from other countries. But from 70s, China began to abandon its closed door policy and open its market to the outside world. It brought some reforms to attract foreign investments. It established trade relations with all countries of the world. Another important event that took place in international politics was the disintegration of USSR in 1991. USSR disintegrated into 15 independent states. Then most of these countries embraced market-oriented economy and became a part of world economy. Thus you will see more and more countries including India, China, Brazil undergoing economic transformation and coming into the fold of world economy. With this, my dear students, we finish the revision of the making of a global world. I hope you must have benefited from this. In the next class, we will meet with one short revision of another lesson. Till then, keep reading and have a nice time. Thank you.